Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the second season of the LCLC podcast.
In our first season, I reviewed the storied 50-year history of the Louisville Conference on Literature and Culture, or the LCLC. I'm your host, Matthew Biberman, and I started this podcast after I was tapped to be the LCLC's new director in the summer of 2021. The second season exists as an aid for me as I work to ensure that the conference continues to stay relevant in the future as a space both for art in the short and in the long term. I do so in order to prepare for our momentous upcoming 50th conference, and looking further ahead, I plan also to engage with artists, writers, and theorists who I see as doing important work in order to expand the space for art here in our country beyond its current precarious location within the Academy.
In this episode, I talk with Aldon Lynn Nielsen, the George and Barbara Kelly Professor of American Literature at Penn State University. Aldon is the author of the recent study, The Inside Songs of Amir Baraka, as well as The Unusual Meme Wars, a book-length conversation between Nielsen and Grammy Award nominee for Best Spoken Word Book, E. Ethelbert Miller. He's also a poet, and his most recent collection from Selve Oscura is entitled Spider Cone. Aldon will be reading from Spider Cone during the LCLC conference at the Brown Hotel at 9 p.m. on Friday, February 24th. And it's an event I'm very much looking forward to. Aldon and I began our conversation by me inviting him to tell us more about the African American Literature and Culture Society and their upcoming panels for our LCLC 50th conference.
In the late 1980s, when the American Literature Association was forming as a coalition of author societies, there were only 2 or 3 formal societies devoted to Black authors at the time, and only one of them was participating in the American Literature Association. So the late Wilfred Samuels and several others of us decided to create this African American Literature and Culture Society, originally to ensure that there would always be a significant representation of Black literature at those conferences. It's now nearly a quarter of a century old, and it sponsors other conferences in other locations from time to time and participates in things like the College Language Association. In the meantime, there's been a proliferation of Black author societies, things like the Pauline Hopkins Society, Langston Hughes Society, and so forth, including, and this still seems odd to me, quite a few societies devoted to living authors, including John Edgar Wideman and Toni Morrison's not living anymore, but it started while she was still alive. So anyway, it's been a fairly active organization appearing at different conferences over the years. I think the first time we appeared at Louisville, I can't remember what year it was, we had a panel on poetry and jazz that went fairly well. So we had one last year, and now we're back with 2 panels this year. The first one, which I'll be chairing on Friday morning, bright and early, includes Laura Vrana from University of South Alabama, the fantastic Evie Shockley, one of the great poet critics of our time from Rutgers, and Yolanda Mackey, who is a PhD student. So on the one hand, it's a panel designed to sort of represent people at different stages of their careers, but also we're ranging from Laura's work on what she calls the Phyllis Wheatley poem. You may know there's been a resurgence of interest in Phyllis Wheatley lately, and quite a few poets, including Honoré Jeffers, have written poetry about Wheatley. Evie Shockley is going to be talking about ekphrasis and the survival of Black being, which is a topic I'm really excited to hear about. Those of you who know her critical work know that she was one of the people who helped spurred the interest in Black writers and nature writing. And Mackey's going to be talking about a reimagining of the Harlem Renaissance, a perpetual source of debate. And then the second panel on Saturday will feature Jean-Philippe Marcoux from Quebec, on the tradition of naming, which is a really exciting topic in African diasporic writing generally. Gregory Perot, whose first book was about the Black Avenger in Western culture. And he's going to be talking about Percival Everett, who I will note was a former keynoter at Louisville some years ago. And finally, Rachel Carr, who is the, I think, outgoing president of the organization now, who's going to be talking about the Red Scare and Zora Neale Hurston. So it's quite a breadth of work that we'll be presenting there. And I hope we'll be able to put on panels a little bit more regularly than we have sometimes in the past. As you no doubt are aware, travel budgets at all the universities have been slashed to the bone over the recent years. And, it's difficult, particularly from some people from lower funded schools to get to as many conferences as they might like. But I'm optimistic. And of course, for anybody who might go to ALA in Boston and Memorial Day weekend, we'll have 5 or 6 panels there in our annual awards, the Stephen Henderson Award, the Darwin Turner Award, and the Octavia Butler Award.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Octavia Butler, another keynote that was at the LCLC some years past. Now, you're also presenting, though, on another panel. Right. There are 2 panels on Umbra. Tell us about what Umbra was and as best you know, what the discussions are going to be on these 2 panels that are focusing on Umbra.
Sure. I prepared by having the copy of the schedule in front of me here. Umbra, full name was the Society of Umbra. It was a workshop of Black writers that started primarily on the Lower East Side, although a lot of the writers were coming from uptown as well, Lower East Side of New York, that is, in the early 1960s. And it's widely seen now as one of the most important precursors of the Black arts movement. And several of the writers that were members of the Umbra Society went on to become important writers in the Black arts period, including Ishmael Reed and, of course, Lorenzo Thomas. At the time the organization was meeting, and they put out a journal as well for a while, Lloyd Addison, who I will be speaking about, was the oldest member of the group. And Lorenzo Thomas, whose collected poems I've co-edited for Wesleyan, was the youngest member of the group. I think he was only like 19 years old back in the day. So if readers of Harriet Mullen's Muse and Drudge might remember an interesting line that pops up in the poem where she talks about slumming Umbra alums. And what she was getting at was the tremendous influence of people who'd been members of the Umbra group, and particularly their role in mentoring and encouraging younger writers. In her case, Tom Dent, who had moved back to New Orleans, and Lorenzo Thomas, who had moved to Texas, were among the fundamental people in helping her as she was getting her early start as a poet in Texas herself. So our panel, the first one, Tyrone Williams is going to be speaking about Rashida Ismaili, which is in some ways a prelude to the other Umbra panel. In the scholarship to date, there has not been enough work on the women writers who are part of Umbra. So the fact that we're going to have a panel on that is really exciting to me. And Rashida Ismaili was one of the primary women members. I'm going to be talking about Lloyd Addison, who's to this day probably one of the least known of the Umbra poets, although he was amazingly prolific. And if I remember right, the whole run of his journal titled Bo Coco is available as a PDF on the Eclipse site. The third speaker, Lori Shire, is going to be talking about the Heritage series. It was a series of publications by Black authors that came out of England, and many of the Umbra writers appeared in that series. Unfortunately, now that China has lifted a lot of their international travel restrictions, her university, Hunan University, has demanded that she come back to teach in person. So she'll be Zooming in. Last year on the Lorenzo Thomas panel, we had to pipe Tyrone Williams in because he'd fallen and hurt his knees and so forth. But the second panel on Saturday is the panel on the women of Umbra. There was a conference on this topic a couple of years ago. I'm sorry to say I wasn't able to be there, but Evie Shockley, again, is going to be chairing that one. Laura Hinton is going to talk about gender trouble within the Society of Umbra, which I'm sure will be a provocative session, getting at the gender. Again, this was the early 60s. Not only did more of the men in Umbra get published than the women, but a lot of the women were helping the men get published and not getting much credit for it. Lori Shire, again, will be talking about Calvin C. Hurton, one of the major figures of the Umbra group, and edited the collected poems of Calvin Hurton along with the British scholar David Grundy, and I think that's just about to come out. And then Tanya Foster, amazing poet herself, is coming from San Francisco State to talk about what we might call the eclipse of Black women in Umbra. Her title is On the Records, The Disappearing of the Black Women of Umbra. I'm not in passing. A lot of people don't know this, but Umbra was not an exclusively Black organization. I'm forgetting Berger's first name, Arthur Berger, whatever his name is. There were a couple of white writers who were involved in that organization too. But again, this was at a time when Black nationalism was starting to erupt. And we didn't see that much of that kind of collaboration, say, from 66 to maybe 1970 or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So these four panels are, to me, they're very exciting material, and strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, politically relevant to our current moment. And I'm thinking, as I'm sure no doubt you'll quickly make the connection as well, to all the brouhaha that DeSantis has created over the idea of teaching AP African American history. And I mean, there's a way in which you would think we would be more mature than this, that here now in 2023, this is still where we are. Yeah. But I wondered if I could get your thoughts about what it means to study and talk about and champion African-American literature in the current American environment.
Well, I'll say a word along the way about how we have evolved within the academy. Like the American Literature Association, the first time I ever attended the Louisville conference, there was a real paucity of panels or even individual papers on Black writers. And if you look at the schedule now, that situation has entirely changed. There are even 2 papers on Melvin Tolson this year, which is just, a breathtaking shift in the general atmosphere. But it's always been a precarious situation for the study of African American writing. And I remember many years ago, Harvard almost lost its Black Studies department, and a new president came along and brought Henry Louis Gates in for the express purpose of hiring a bunch of really famous people and getting it back in running order. But, all over the United States, universities are trying to tell Black Studies departments to combine with other ethnic studies departments to save money. The tenure situation is usually fraught in one way or another. So this has been an ongoing battle. It's really been stepped up, as you point out, because of these political reasons. When you look at DeSantis, it's clear he would prefer there not be any Black studies of any kind whatsoever in the public schools. This is, what lies behind this Heritage Foundation-sponsored attack on critical race theory by people who clearly have no idea what it is to start with. And you see this in Florida's official response to the AP proposed African American Studies course. One of the things they singled out was intersectionality, any talk about intersectionality, and particularly Kimberly Crenshaw. What wasn't noticed much in the news media when this first came up is that Crenshaw wasn't even a major part of anything. She was listed as a secondary source. But because she was so fundamental to the establishment of intersectionality as a, if you will, a philosophical approach or a legal studies approach, they don't even want to see her name anywhere near this. They don't want to see the word intersectionality. And in the official state response, they describe intersectionality as something that ranks people by their race, ethnicity, and gender. And of course, it does absolutely no such thing. If anything, it does the opposite of that. But, these people who are, DeSantis and his administration, same thing in Texas, same thing in several other states, they know that the general population is not reading these books and doesn't know anything about what's going on. So when you tell the voters of a state, ooh, this terrible woke thing is going to tell your kid that he's a male chauvinist, white racist, and so forth and so on, people get very upset, and they go to school board meetings and carry guns and so forth and so on. I haven't run into this quite as explicitly in Pennsylvania, but I did. My freshman English course last semester was a banned books course. And it was funny. On the very first day of classes, we were going to the syllabus. I told the students that every book on the syllabus had been banned somewhere except the introduction to critical race theory. And I said, the book hasn't been banned, just the topic. Well, sure enough, within the week, a library system in Plano, Texas, took the very book we were reading off of the shelves and moved it back into the offices, so that in order to read that book, you not only have to know it exists, but you have to go up to the library's desk and ask for it, as if you were asking for a book like Henry Miller or something. In fact, Henry Miller is easier to read in school libraries than Kimberly Crenshaw these days. I was just interviewed a week ago by a young woman who was doing a series of articles on these issues for small newspapers around Pennsylvania and Indiana. And it struck me as we were talking that what this really is an attempt, yet again, at suppression of blackness. They would never say that. They couldn't legally say that. But when you read these definitions of things that you cannot teach, it's very clear that is what they are up to. And, the old saying, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, we've really been pushed back an astonishing direction at this point. So far, most of the universities in the United States haven't been under direct attack, but we saw the journalism school in UNC.
I wanted to ask another question, sort of a narrower question, that part of my being able to take some satisfaction in the development of the LCLC, as you noted, is to see that representation of scholars and of the content of African American literature and of ethnic literature in general has really blossomed over the years, particularly under the tenure of my predecessor, Alan Golding. And that's great to see. And in particular, I think the presence here at the Louisville conference challenges a notion that we still see, that African American literature isn't intellectual in the way in which, when we engage with experimental poetry that the LCLC is really known for, that we're not going to see African American practitioners, and we're not going to talk about African American literature, in rigorous ways. Do you think that this is a battle that that we still need to fight, or do you think it's been won?
Well, it'll never be finally won, but no, this is another battle I've been fighting my whole career. Back in the 90s, when I wrote the book Black Chant, what I found myself up against, and people would actually say this to me. They would say that, while these white poets, for example, most of the language poets, Erica Hunt was in there too, but it was mostly a white movement. They said, while the white poets were doing all this avant-garde experimentalism, the black poets and the women were telling their stories. And of course, everyone told their stories, white, black, and whatever. But on the one hand, it was a way of not having to read the more experimental black poets, and thus, forwarding the pretense that somehow they didn't exist. These terms, experimental, innovative, avant-garde, are always much in dispute. I can't get too excited about that discussion. Anytime you call someone innovative, someone will point to an earlier person that did the same thing. If you talk about experimental poetry, people will compare it to science and say that's not what we're doing. But if you look in your OED at the word experimental, you'll find that there's an older meaning that's never gone away, having to do with things being experiential. And you find this even in the Puritan poets of the 17th century, talking about having an experimental knowledge of Christ. It doesn't mean they had a scientific hypothesis. It means that there was some sort of experience involved in this. So that's a term for poetry that I feel comfortable still using, because the poets we're talking about are people who are not just trying to pass some message to the reader, but are trying to create art that is in and of itself an experiment worth having and returning to and contemplating, the way you would a good painting or a great piece of music. And Black poets have always done that. There's never been a time in our history when there weren't Black poets doing that. Same thing with Chicano poets, Jewish American poets. We could go down the list. And MELIS, the Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the United States organization, has been carrying on this struggle for a very long time, trying to foreground more of this work. Myself, people like Tyrone Williams, Laurie Shire, and others have particularly emphasized the more experimental end of these things, partly because we wanted to bring it to a wider attention, especially because people had acted like it didn't even exist.
So in getting into the conversation of understanding the complexity of thinking about experimental and experiencing and embodied aesthetic experiences, part of what's so much fun for us about the LCLC is we don't just talk about poetry, we get to perform poetry and enjoy poetry. And your alter ego, AL, is going to be making an appearance at the Brown Friday evening. Tell us about that.
Well, I'm going to be I'm not forgetting a name. So I'm going to be on a program with Mark Scroggins and Brock. I forget Brock's last name.
Russell.
Thank you, because I haven't actually met him yet. I've known Mark forever. I think I first met him at the Louisville conference. But yeah, this one's going to be sponsored by the Selva Oscura Press. And we're going to have a little bit of a surprise in my segment of the program. It could turn out to be a train wreck because we have not done what we're going to do ever before. But train wrecks can be interesting to watch, so we'll see what happens. But there's also a personal note here you would know nothing about. The only time I ever submitted to be on one of Louisville's creative panels, I got rejected. So it's something of a personal pleasure to be coming back again in a featured way. Yeah.
Great. Well, that makes me very happy to know that we get to right that wrong.
So even though we've gotten very good at sort of smuggling ourselves into the departments of literature and English, we really need to that's another struggle we need to carry on to try to make it more possible for graduate students who are already in a precarious position anyway to consider doing their work primarily in poetry.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that it's advisable to graduate students now and the younger generation coming up to make an effort to involve themselves in, if they're interested in this sort of thing, to involve themselves in societies like the African American Literature and Culture Society?
Absolutely. For the same reason I tell people to try to get to conferences. I've always known colleagues, mostly older colleagues, who would say really negative things about MLA and tell students that they shouldn't waste their time writing conference papers because they have to get the dissertation and so on. Again, thinking about our field in particular, I mean, the field of poetry scholarship, unless you're at a huge place like Penn State, if you're fortunate enough to get a tenure-track job, you're very likely to be the only person there who does whatever it is you do. Not just poetry, but whatever, unless you're like in, mainstream canonical British authors or something. And so conferences are where you meet the other people in your field. And again, this is why Louisville has been so important. Once I was teaching back east again and had a little bit of travel funds, I returned to going to Louisville every single year because I could meet all these other people, including brand new people, including grad students who are doing work in poetry, and hear the work that they're doing and make connections for the future. Two of the books that I've published came directly out of meeting people at a conference and finding a mutual interest. And even from last year's Louisville conference, there are at least 3 young scholars that have been in email touch with me ever since about the projects they're working on. So, yeah, by all means, even at the graduate student level, get involved in these societies and these conferences, because they will form a real basis for the work you're going to do in the future. Not to mention all the good drinks with friends.
I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with Aldon Lynn Nielsen. If you have, please hit like, subscribe, and consider writing a review or telling a friend. And as always, please consider joining us for an upcoming LCLC. To learn more, visit us online at thelouisvilleconference.com or contact me directly, Matthew Biberman, LCLC Director. Thanks again for listening.